Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. This time I'm going to be talking about environmental protections in the Soviet Union of the Lenin era and mostly in the Stalin era. There's this popular anti-communist idea that the Soviet Union was very bad for the environment and that the Soviet Union did not care about the environment. But that idea is actually quite false. Actually, in the period of Lenin and Stalin, the Soviet Union was one of the leading countries in environmentalism, if not the leading country. However, the environmentalism of the Soviet Union was somewhat different than the environmentalism of capitalist countries, and the environmental regulations were also somewhat different from environmental regulations which exist today. This area is not very well researched. The main sources that I use in this video are a paper by historian Stephen Brain called Stalin's Environmentalism, and also his book on the same topic called The Song of the Forest, Russian Forestry and Stalinist Environmentalism 1905 to 1953. Stephen Brain is an anti-communist historian, but some of the things that he says in his paper and in his book are quite useful, and it seems that he has started to change the view on the environmentalism of the Soviet Union in the Stalin period, at least somewhat. But let's just get into the actual topic, shall we? So this is what Stephen Brain says in Stalin's Environmentalism. He says, quote, "Environmentalism survived and even thrived in Stalin's Soviet Union, establishing levels of protection unparalleled anywhere in the world." In his book, he says, quote, "The Soviet Union in the 1940s went about protecting from exploitation more forested land than any other country in history. Accordingly, it is accurate to say that the Soviet Union developed a real and effective environmentalist program. Stalin emerges as a peculiar kind of environmentalist. His policies withdrew millions of hectares of forest from economic exploitation on the grounds that this would improve the hydrology of the Soviet Union. These millions of hectares were left more or less untouched, in keeping with the supposition that complex wild forests best regulated water flows, and thus one may conclude that Stalin's policies were steadfastly environmentalist, and because of the way they were carried out, preservationist as well." Unquote. Preservationism, as far as I know, just means that nature is preserved, pristine and untouched. He continues, quote, "Stalin also actively promoted forest environmentalism for the benefit of the state, establishing levels of protection unparalleled anywhere in the world. Stalin's environmental policies codified into law an assumption that healthy land was forested land and that deforestation represented serious environmental dangers to the state's large project of modernization in the form of droughts, floods, hydrological disturbances and crop failures. Forest protection ultimately rose to such prominence during the last 6 years of Stalin's rule that the Politburo took control of the Soviet forest away from the Ministry of Heavy Industry and elevated the nation's Forest Conservation Bureau to the dominant position in implementing policy." Unquote. So the Soviet Union clearly had strong environmental protection laws and policies in place, but the reason wasn't some abstract idealist notion of, oh, we just have to protect nature for some unexplainable reason. No, most of those reasons were quite practical reasons and scientifically based reasons. They were concerned with the spread of deserts, deforestation, spread of droughts, sandstorms, floods, erosion, and also the damage that erosion could do to hydrological power plants. So they were mostly concerned with things like that, although not exclusively. But those are all very real and serious threats which should be taken into account, and the Soviet Union did take them into account, and as a result established much stronger environmental protections than any other country at the time. But how did that end, right? What happened next? Well, Stephen Brain writes in his book, quote, "After Stalin's death, the conservation bureaus fell from their prominent position." Unquote. So, after Stalin died, and the revisionists, the Khrushchevites and the opportunists took power, the Soviet Union then embarked on a different kind of policy where all these environmental protections were torn down. So in his paper, Stephen Brain states that, quote, such an assertion clearly represents a significant revision to the existing consensus about Soviet environmental politics, which holds that Stalin's government was implacably hostile to environmentalist initiatives, unquote. So the consensus, so-called in Western academia and in anti-communist academia generally, for decades has been that, oh yeah, the Soviet Union, especially Stalin, they were just bad for the environment and it's all Stalin's fault, and especially Stalin was the most anti-environmentalist of them all. Once again, we see that the so-called academia and Western so-called historians and experts, etc., that they're just completely wrong. They're completely, pardon my French, but full of shit. Completely full of shit. Okay, so if this consensus is so wrong, how did it come about? Well, let's take a look. Quote, the shortcomings of Soviet environmental policy, which actually took place in the revisionist period and not in the Stalin period, have been extrapolated into a sweeping conclusion that conservation or preservationist awareness in the Stalin era was entirely lacking, unquote. So, the revisionists in the Soviet Union actually carried out projects in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, which actually did have very serious environmental effects. Things which are usually mentioned are like the Siberian oil industry, gas industry, probably most famously the drying of the Aral Sea, because of projects that were started in the 60s and 70s. However, in the Stalin era, the USSR actually had a completely opposite kind of policy. In the Stalin era, the USSR was a leading environmentalist power in the world. But because the revisionists caused such environmental damage, that has then been extrapolated backwards, and they say Stalin industrialized the country, the revisionists carried out environmental degradation, which is tied to industry, at least partially, therefore it's somehow Stalin's fault, or Stalin must have also been an anti-environmentalist. But that's not supported by facts. And as Stephen Brain says, it has been extrapolated into a sweeping conclusion that conservationist or preservationist awareness in the Stalin era was entirely lacking, when that's clearly not the case. Lenin and Stalin actually already supported environmental protections and already in the 1920s called for more forestation because a lot of forests had been cut down previously. The massive clear-cutting started especially in World War I. And in his book, Stephen Brain says, quote, Lenin and Stalin called for aggressive afforestation at party conferences in the 1920s, unquote. However, in the Lenin and Stalin periods, the USSR did emphasize that humanity must use science to improve production, to build industry, electricity, etc. Statements were made which emphasized that humanity changes the world and that humanity should be able to regulate the environment and not be at the mercy of the environment. These statements were then later taken out of context and twisted to serve as supposed evidence of Soviet hostility towards nature. Quote, by the late 1980s, scholars of Soviet environmental history had documented a number of grave environmental problems in Russia, many of which had roots or appeared to have roots in the Stalin era. Well, how did they appear to have roots in the Stalin era? Well, Stephen Brain continues, Soviet Promethean proclamations from the 1930s, typified by Gorky's famous dictum, man in changing nature changes himself, and Ivan Michurin's motto, we cannot wait for kindnesses from nature, our task is to wrest them from her, strongly influenced this view, along with accounts of the mammoth engineering projects of the first five-year plan. The failure to adopt meaningful emissions controls like those enacted in the West in the 1960s further reinforced the impression of Stalinist enmity towards nature, unquote. So let's unpack what he just said. So, in the 1980s, Western academics had documented that there were environmental problems in Russia. Right, sure. And that those problems appeared to have roots in the Stalin era. Well, how? Well, because in the Stalin era, Gorky and Michurin and other people, they made statements like, man changes nature, and we cannot wait for kindnesses from nature, but we must wrest them from nature. And Michurin actually had a very specific meaning when he said that we shouldn't just randomly cross different plants and then select whichever randomly seem to be the best plants, but instead we should plan beforehand which plants we're gonna hybridize. So Michurin's statement actually has absolutely nothing to do with any kind of environmental degradation. It doesn't even have anything to do with industry. But yes, in the Stalin era they did make statements about how man needs to change nature, and man needs to not be at the mercy of nature, but be able to regulate nature. But that can also be an environmentalist statement, because the act of trying to combat sandstorms, for instance, or to combat erosion, or to combat deforestation, those are also acts of man controlling and regulating nature, instead of just leaving nature to suffer catastrophes. So just because they wanted to regulate certain aspects of nature and, for example, prevent deforestation, that doesn't in any way prove that they were hostile to nature or that they didn't care about nature. And Stephen Brain recognizes this. He's just saying that this is the type of faulty reasoning that was used to construct this false view. And then he says that there were these massive engineering projects of the first 5-year plan. So just because they built industry, that somehow means that they hate nature and that they are against environmentalism, which again is a ridiculous statement and is not supported by facts. And then the last point is most interesting. The failure to adopt meaningful emissions controls like those enacted in the West in the 1960s reinforced the impression of Stalinist enmity towards nature. Well, the funny thing about that is that in the 1960s, Stalin had already been dead. So if in the 1960s the Soviet Union failed to do something, well, that has absolutely nothing to do with Stalin, because Stalin was already dead. And as we already saw, the revisionists and opportunists who took power after Stalin's death, they actually reversed all of Stalin's policies. So the fact that the Soviet Union didn't have emissions controls in the 1960s is not Stalin's fault. Quite the opposite. Stephen Brain gives another example of this consensus view. He says, quote, Ronald Sunny's discussion of the first 5-year plan provides a representative expression of this interpretation. Quote, insensitivity to limits of nature was characteristic of capitalist industrialization as well, but in the Soviet Union, general ecological ignorance was compounded by the bravado of the communists, unquote. And then Brain states that, so dominant is this interpretation that countervailing evidence has been unable to shake it. So even though there is obvious evidence to the contrary, anti-communists have still clung to this false idea. In his paper, Stephen Brain, for instance, shows that in this graph you see Group 1 and Group 2 forests were forests which were protected or strongly regulated, and Group 3 forests were forests which were not regulated. And I'll get more into what that means later, but in this graph you can see that even though the total of lumber harvests increased all the time, Group 1 and Group 2 forests were more and more protected all the time, so the lumber harvests in those forests went consistently down, and instead the lumber harvests in Group 3 forests increased. Basically, the forests which needed to be protected, they reduced cutting those, and the forests which didn't need to be protected, they instead compensated by cutting those more. So clearly they tried to take into account the environment. And this is what Stephen Brain says in his book, quote, the Stalinist political and economic system made meaningful economic and political sacrifices in the interests of environmentalism, unquote. So somebody might claim that, oh yeah, they just supported environmentalism whenever it coincided with their other goals. Stephen Brain says that they were even willing to make meaningful economic and political sacrifices if the environment required it. Brain says that the most sophisticated version of this consensus view, represented by Douglas Weiner, stated that there was some nature protection in the Lenin era in the form of non-governmental nature preserve scientific stations or zapovedniki. However, because these non-governmental preserves were abolished in the Stalin era when socialism was constructed, Weiner then claims that this proves that Stalinism is entirely hostile to environmentalism. So Weiner claims, oh yeah, Lenin supported the environment, but Stalin hated it. But this claim is entirely fallacious. in the Stalin era, these non-governmental nature preserves were abolished only because they were replaced by even more powerful state-enforced environmental protections and state-controlled nature preserves. I don't believe that Weiner could be so ignorant. I think he must be either somehow just deeply misguided or deliberately dishonest. Just because the non-governmental preserves were dismantled, that doesn't mean that nature preserves themselves in general were dismantled. The environmental protections were at their peak and at their strongest precisely in the Stalin era. It is true that the USSR did not have emission controls like several countries have today, and that is sometimes used as a criticism of the USSR, but this argument is also illogical. Because in those years, in the years of Lenin and Stalin, emission controls did not exist in any country. They did not exist anywhere. There was no such idea, there was no such concept. And there were practically no environmental protections or environmental protection laws in any capitalist country at all to speak of at the time. I'm not an expert on environmental law, but from what I saw, some capitalist countries had some laws like you're not allowed to poison the drinking water and certain things like that. But in general, capitalist countries didn't care about the environment at all in those years. There were no environmental laws per se. This is what A. Dan Tarlock says in the History of Environmental Law. He says that, quote, prior to the 1960s, environmental law did not exist as a discrete domestic and international legal category, unquote. So, either internationally nor domestically it just didn't exist. Except, perhaps in the USSR, as we shall see further. And Tarlock also says that, quote, environmental law is a byproduct of the rise of environmentalism as a political force throughout the world only since the 1960s, unquote. So again, it's a bit silly to attack Lenin and Stalin by saying, oh, they didn't have emissions controls, when emissions controls were only something that was created in the 1960s based on knowledge of the 1960s. And of course there's many other political aspects when it comes to environmental laws and how it's easy for rich Western countries to protect the environment when they just export all their pollution to the third world and whatever, but I'm not going to get into that because otherwise we'll be here all day. In the capitalist world, there was also no concept or understanding of the biosphere as something which needed protection. This is what Tarlock says, quote, the science-based idea that the biosphere was a fragile system vulnerable to human-induced impairment only became widely accepted after World War II, unquote. And you want to know who came up with the science-based concept of the biosphere? It was actually a Soviet scientist named V.I. Vernadsky, one of the two founders of Soviet geochemistry and of modern geochemistry in general. He's also one of the founders of radiogeology and biogeochemistry and many other fields. He's most noted for his 1926 book, The Biosphere, where he elaborates the concept. He didn't invent the word biosphere, but he invented the scientific concept of it. In 1943, he was awarded the Stalin Prize for this book. So it all somehow ties back to Stalin. Vernadsky was a student of an earlier scientist named V.V. Dokuchaev, and the idea that nature was fragile and that it could be harmed by human action was already something researched and pioneered by Dokuchaev. In the Russian Empire, Dokuchaev mainly became interested in natural disasters because of terrible famine that happened in the Russian Empire. He wanted to start forestation projects, but he didn't really get government support for his ideas at the time. But in the Soviet Union, his ideas became very prevalent, even dominant. They inspired many people in different fields, of course in forest protection, but also in geochemistry and biogeochemistry. An example of that would be V.I. Vernadsky, and also in agricultural and grassland ecology in the works of people like V.R. Williams. But anti-communists have always dismissed these scientists or have ignored them. As a result, they spread the interpretation that Stalin's Soviet Union was hostile to environmentalism and to sustainable practices. This is what Stephen Brain says in his paper, quote, "So dominant is this interpretation that countervailing evidence has been unable to shake it. William Husband's recent survey of Soviet children's literature from the Stalin era, for instance, revealed a multiplicity of encoded attitudes towards nature, with a small but significant number of books depicting nature in a non-adversarial way." So imagine that, like, they have books which depict nature in a positive way, and then they act like that's some kind of discovery. No, that's not a discovery. Of course they have books which depict nature in a positive way. But he continues, "Yet for Husband, such sympathetic portrayals of nature did not suggest a more complex attitude towards the environment, but instead represented only a failure of totalitarianism. Stalinist-era literature," he writes, "eluded the hegemony the dictatorship sought, and in so doing it demonstrated an important limit to political control in the USSR." That is ridiculous. Although the English scholar Jonathan Oldfield recently pointed out the need for scholars to move purposefully beyond broad understandings of the Soviet environmental legacy in order to check a tendency towards overtly crude interpretations of Soviet environmental degradation, the consensus remains basically unchallenged, unquote. So this researcher, William Husband, actually claims that because the Soviet Union had books which depicted nature in a positive way, it must be because the state just couldn't make people hate nature even though they wanted to. That is literally so completely absurd that I can't even put it into words. It is also wrong to claim that the environment or the forests were protected only because of industrial or agricultural reasons, although, of course, those were priorities. There are examples of discussions of the aesthetic and psychological benefits of the forests as well. For instance, from, quote, a December 1917 editorial in the journal Forest Life and Management, claiming that the forest has always had an enormous beneficial influence on the psyche and spiritual store of humans, to the speech of a delegate at a January 1949 forest conference, asserting that the forest is an enormous moral force for our country, unquote. It's actually interesting, there were even artistic works specifically promoting nature, such as the Song of the Forest by Dmitrii Shostakovich. So now, let's talk about what the history of environmentalism in the USSR concretely looked like. Stephen Brain states, quote, "In the 1920s, when representatives of the industrial bureaus advanced visions of a new socialized landscape with highly abstracted, regularized forests and logging quotas based on industrial demand, the party leadership sided with conservationists who championed traditional ideas such as sustainable yield. But later in the 1930s, after industrialists and student activists succeeded in labeling such concepts as bourgeois, advocates of conservationism regained the upper hand by citing the theories of the pre-revolutionary soil scientist V.V. Dokuchaev, who linked the hydrological stability of Russia to the maintenance of permanent forest cover. After 1931, hydrological concerns became the justification for the creation of a vast forest reserve in the center of European Russia, at the time the largest in the world," unquote. So briefly, in his paper and in his book, Stephen Brain explains that massive clear-cutting of forests started already in the Russian Empire and escalated and became catastrophic during World War I. When the October Revolution happened, they still kept clear-cutting forests because there was just terrible poverty and destruction and they just needed all the resources they could get. And then during the Civil War and war communism, they continued this unsustainable clear-cutting. But during war communism, they developed this idea that, okay, once we win the war and the economy improves, then we will plant all these forests back. So we will repair the damage that we have caused. And here is a picture of a poster from the Civil War communism period. Once the Civil War ends and they introduce the new economic policy, or NEP, there is a debate basically between two schools of thought. Both have their roots in the pre-revolutionary scientific establishment. The conservationists following a scientist named Morozov, and the industrializers following a scientist named Bogoslavsky. And originally the government sides with Morozov, or the conservationists, so the Soviet government wants to protect forests. In the early 30s, in the first five-year plan, there's of course intense class struggle and intense ideological struggle. The followers of Bogoslavsky, they label Morozov and his followers as bourgeois. They said that you guys are hindering industrialization with all these restrictions and regulations. For a very brief period, the government is like, okay, sure, makes sense. But then almost immediately, the government again turns against Bogoslavsky and starts supporting Morozov and the people who want to protect the environment. But basically, in the first years of the first five-year plan, there were some ultra-left tendencies and some ultra-left industrializers temporarily gained power, but then they lost it. So now, let's look at the environmental regulations of 1931. Quote, Stalin personally initiated legislation predicated on the belief that Russia's hydrology necessitated forest protection. Party archives show that on May 30th, 1931, Stalin raised the topic for discussion on the order of cutting of timber, requesting Sovnarkom to prepare in a month's term a draft law about the absolute forbiddance of cutting timber in certain regions so as to conserve the water in other regions. On July 15th, Sovnarkom, which is the Council of People's Commissars, so basically the ministries, returned its draft law to the Politburo, and by the end of July 1931, Decree number 519, dividing all forests of the country into two zones, the Forest Industrial Zone and the Forest Cultivation Zone, became law, unquote. Quote, regardless of which bureau controlled them, the forests in a 1-kilometer belt along both banks of the Volga, Dnieper, Don and the Ural rivers were made off limits to any logging whatsoever, unquote. So that was the first important law where Dokuchayev's ideas started to be applied. So Dokuchayev was this great scientist. He discovered many things. He discovered that soil evolves, and because of these ideas he was considered materialist and even dialectical materialist by the Soviets. He discovered that the soil is like an interconnected whole that has evolved and continues to evolve, and he basically thought that deforestation would cause changes in the water balance. I believe that if the soil has roots in it, such as tree roots, then it retains water better. And if you cut down all the trees, then the soil is not going to retain the water, it's going to erode, it's going to turn into a wasteland. So he thought that the terrible famine in the late 1800s was caused by soil degradation, and he thought that it was made worse by the spread of dry winds, which can spread without any kind of hindrance because the forests are gone, and also the soil is completely messed up. So on that basis, Stalin personally initiates this law that they need to implement protected forest belts 1 kilometer wide along both banks of all these massive rivers, the Volga, Dnieper, Don and Ural rivers, and you are not allowed to cut those trees whatsoever. So that was the start. Then the next important step happened in 1936. So it's worth noting that the ultra-left industrializers briefly held sway, but already in 1931, so already that early, they were curbed. And Morozov, even though he wasn't perfect, his ideas were still highly regarded in the USSR and further developed. But let's look at the 1936 regulations. Quote, the party leadership chose in 1936 to strengthen forest protection further by greatly expanding the zone of protection and, with Stalin's direct participation, by creating a powerful new administration to enforce the new regulations. In July 1936, a new agency was founded, the Main Administration of Forest Protection and Afforestation, GLO, whose sole duty would be to look after the lands henceforth called water protective forests. Forbidden under the threat of criminal responsibility was any cutting of the forest, aside from sanitary cutting, basically to stop the spread of diseases and other problems in the forest, in vast zones lying A, in a 20-kilometer belt along the Dnieper and two of its tributaries, the Don and 3 of its tributaries, the Volga and 10 of its tributaries, the Ural and the western Dvina. B. In a 6-kilometer belt along 2 tributaries of the Dnieper, 4 tributaries of the Don, 5 tributaries of the Volga, 2 tributaries of the Ural, and 2 tributaries of the Oka. And C. In a 4-kilometer belt along 5 tributaries of the Don, 11 of the Volga, 1 of the Bel, and 1 of the Oka. In the areas that lay outside these belts but still inside the basins of the rivers named above, logging was allowed, but this would be conducted by the GLO, and the harvest could not exceed the annual growth of the forest in question." Unquote. So the priority was to protect the forests on the banks of these massive rivers and all their tributaries, with protected zones as much as 20 kilometers on both sides of all these rivers, throughout the entire length of these rivers, and in all the forests that were nearby. You could harvest them, but it had to be sustainable. Quote, "The 1936 law reached far beyond the scope of its predecessor. These protected zones were so extensive that they amounted to a majority or near majority of forest land in most oblasts of central Russia, and moreover a significant percentage of total land in many oblasts. The initiative came from the very top of the party apparatus. As the deputy head of Narkomzem's forest protection arm, V.M. Solovyev, reported to a convention of foresters, this unusual law, comrades, a turning point in forest management, was developed under the direct guidance and with the direct participation of Stalin himself." Unquote. A further improvement is made in 1943, which is quite significant because it means that even during the war, they devoted time and effort to protecting the environment. Quote, "Soviet forest protection grew yet more robust. On April 23, 1943, dividing the nation's forest into 3 groups, 2 of which were subject to protective measures. Into Group 1 went the forest of the state Zapovedniki, or the state scientific forest preserves, soil protective, field protective, and resort forests, and forests of green zones around industrial firms and towns. In these forests, only sanitary cuts and selective cuts of over-mature timber were allowed, with clear cuts of all types forbidden. In Group 2 went all the forests of Central Asia and along the left bank of the Volga. Here only cuts less than or equal to the annual growth, ratified by Sovnarkom, were allowed. So only sustainable cutting, and it had to be accepted by the Council of People's Commissars. So that is insanely tight environmental regulations. Group 1 and 2 forests remained under the control of the GLO. In Group 3 were grouped all other forests on which no restrictions whatsoever were imposed. So only those you could clear cut. The 1943 classification greatly expanded upon the protections provided by the 1936 law. The forests of entire oblasts, among them Moscow, Voronezh, Kursk, Smolensk, Vladimir, Tambov, Penza, Ryazan, Saratov, Rostov, and Stalingrad, were placed in Groups 1 and 2, protecting them, at least ideally, from all exploitation. Over time, the size of Group 1 forests grew tremendously, until they represented by far the world's largest area so protected." Unquote. That is quite impressive. Then let's look at the last period, the 1947 to 1953 regulations and the peak of forest protection. Quote, "Stalin-era environmentalism reached its zenith in 1947 with the creation of the Ministry of Forest Management, Minles cause." Unquote. Quote, "The period of 1947 to 1953 indeed did represent a high point in Soviet forest management." Unquote. Quote, "Forest protection in general received more institutional support during the years from 1947 to 1953 than at any other time in Russian history." Unquote. So take that in. In the 60s, Professor Viktor Nestorov of the Timryatsev Agricultural Academy basically complained about the bad state of affairs in 1966, and he wrote in Pravda on January 19, 1966 that, quote, "There is a pressing need for an all-union forest management agency with its own system of subordinate organizations. Specialists expressed the opinion that a USSR Ministry of Forestry could become such a competent agency. Incidentally, such a ministry existed from 1947 to 1953. During that time, forest workers managed to do a great deal. The amount of sowing and planting of new groves was sharply expanded, and the trimming of the cutting areas was achieved everywhere. The ministry set up 200 forest protection stations outfitted with machinery. The annual volume of forest sowing and planting increased sevenfold. We are by no means thinking of idealizing the activity of this ministry, but the results of its work were apparent to everyone who had anything to do with the forests." Unquote. During this period, they launched a big plan to grow new forests. I can't really go into that in any detail because it's just outside the scope of this video, but I will briefly read a couple quotes. This is from Jack Weiner's article. He says that, quote, "In 1890, the soil scientist Dokuchayev experimented with shelter forest belts. I told you earlier that because of the terrible famine, Dokuchayev wanted to plant these forest belts to stop environmental destruction, but at the time that didn't really work. During the Soviet period, scientists continued to plant trees, millions of them, in order to increase agricultural productivity, particularly on the collective farms and in the wooded steppes of European Russia. The greatest impetus and plan for afforestation and reforestation were apparently Stalin's. In 1948, he supposedly laid the groundwork for a 15-year project to plant trees on more than 10 million acres. Obviously, the plan benefited the Soviet Union." Unquote. This plan was started. It was called the Plan for the Transformation of Nature, but it was cancelled by opportunists and revisionists who came to power later. But that is outside the scope of this video. I can't really go into all that. This was something that was reported in Kommunisti, the theoretical journal of the Finnish Communist Party in 1950, about that plan as it was ongoing at the time. Quote, "Shelter forest belts have been planted already on more than 800,000 hectares, 306,800 hectares in this spring alone. An irrigation system for 122,000 hectares has been completed, for which it was necessary to build 8,000 irrigation pools and water tanks. The tasks for this year include planting of 700,000 hectares of forests and building of 7,587 irrigation pools." Unquote. The purpose of that was obviously to stop deforestation, the spread of harsh, dry winds and storms, sandstorms and other things like that, and also to stop the spread of deserts. And then lastly, about the destruction of environmental protections by the opportunists and Khrushchevite revisionists. Stephen Brain says in his book that, quote, "After Stalin's death, the conservation bureaus fell from their prominent position," unquote. And in his paper, he says in more detail that, quote, "The period when mindless costs dominated Soviet forest management, however, was brief. On March 15, 1953, 6 days after Stalin's funeral, mindless cause was liquidated." So they really didn't wait at all. They were just like, oh, he's dead. With the functions of mindless cause transferred to the Ministry of Agriculture, forest conservation fell into deep decline. The number of workers assigned to forest matters in Moscow fell from 927 to 342 in the space of 6 months, a drop of 62%, and then to 120 workers after a year, unquote. So within a year, from almost 1,000 to only 120. So they really didn't waste any time. I know that in this one I spoke mostly about the forestry stuff, but if I can find more good sources, then I might cover other aspects of Soviet environmentalism. Like I might do a video on grassland ecology, for instance, at some point, if I can just find enough sources about it.